My session is going to be called A Park for the People, the changing face of Boultham Park and the adjoining housing development from the 20s to the 30s. So a People's Park. It's slightly Blairite, isn't it? But anyway, public parks became a relatively common element of the urban landscape during the Victorian period. These were spaces either acquired by corporations or donated to townspeople by benefactors, often industrialists. The public parklands often took as their inspiration the principles used in the design of 18th century private parks designed by luminaries such as Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. The aim underlying the parks movement was often regarded as an improving one, to provide the urban working class with a space in which to enjoy rational recreation, which was to enhance both their physical and their moral well-being. Now, the first urban public park was Derby Arboretum, opened in 1840. Others followed in many industrial centres, particularly northern industrial centres. Prince's Park in Liverpool in 1842, Phillips Park in Manchester in 1846, and Birkenhead Park in 1847, famously and perhaps slightly incredulously thought to be the inspiration for New York's Central Park. Now, Lincoln's first purpose-built public park was the Arboretum, which was opened amidst much ceremony in 1872, designed by Edward Milner, one of the great Victorian garden designers, who had been an apprentice at Chatsworth House to Joseph Paxton, designer of the Great Exhibition. Now, Boultham Park contrasted in many ways to the Arboretum. It assumed its status as a public park considerably later, in 1929, when it was acquired by Lincoln Corporation. Now, whilst the Arboretum had been designed specifically as a public park, Boultham Park had, as we've heard, originally been the private grounds of the Ellison family and had been part of that family's estate. But although Boultham Park has been a public park since only 1929, the Ellison family, as Rob has indicated, regularly invited selected members of the public to enjoy the park's surroundings whilst the grounds were in private ownership. In July 1895, for instance, the Ellisons enabled the 2nd Volunteer Battalion of the Lincolnshire Regiment to camp in the grounds, as Rob's noted. 4 years later, in June 1899, the public were invited into the grounds to watch the activities of the Volunteer Battalion under the command of Colonel Ellison himself. Other activities regularly staged in the grounds, which were open to the public, included the annual flower show held in the southern part of Boultham Park. And the Ellisons also regularly used their park for political ends. Again, as Rob has noted, the Primrose League demonstrations associated with the Conservative Party took place in the grounds. This, unfortunately, isn't a photo of the Primrose League at Boultham Hall, but it gives you an idea of the sorts of people who might be in attendance at such events. Now, the Ellison family departed from Boultham Hall in 1909, and the building remained empty until the First World War. You can see some development taking place in the area around this time. Here we see Boultham Park Road in its early stages. And during the First World War, Boultham Hall was used as a military convalescent home. But following the war, much of the Boultham estate was sold off, and large numbers of houses were built along Boultham Park Road and Rookery Lane. 20 years after the departure of the Ellisons, Lincoln Corporation acquired Boultham Hall and what remained of its grounds, with the intention of transforming it into a public park. And although the council bought the land which became the public park in the late 1920s, discussions had actually taken place regarding this possibility many years earlier. In 1919, for instance, the council's Parks and Cemeteries Committee recommended to the Finance Committee that the council should look into acquiring Boultham Hall and grounds to become a museum, an art gallery and a park. And of course the art gallery thought was rather put on the back burner when James Usher made his bequest to the city for the construction of an art gallery in his name, which opened in 1927. So between 1919 and 1929, the Parks and Cemeteries Committee considered several times the possibility of the council taking on Boultham Hall and its grounds to become a park and recreation ground. Various discussions took place with the owners of the house and grounds, but no agreement could be reached for many years. But finally, in 1928, the council acquired Boultham Hall and 94 acres of the parkland for the sum of £9,800, following an agreement with Mrs. Elizabeth Blank. Now, the sale went through following the approval of the Ministry of Health, which allowed the council to borrow the money to make the purchase. Interesting, it was the Ministry of Health involved at that time. Now, since the aesthetics of the public park movement had largely drawn its inspiration from private parklands, perhaps not surprisingly, in the first instance, there was no need to make major changes to the layout of the hall's grounds, which had first been laid out in about 1830, as Rob was mentioning, with the ornamental lake being added a little later, probably around the 1850s. A report in the Lincolnshire Chronicle on the 7th of May 1932 detailed the way in which the grounds had been restored by the corporation. Lawns had been trimmed, shrubberies thinned out, flower beds planted, a wild garden and rockery had been laid out, and a place previously of waste ground had been transformed into a herbaceous garden. Structural changes had included the gravelling and asphalting of paths within the park, and the lake, which was eventually to be available for boating, had been deepened and the drains cleared out. The 1932 report also referred to swans nesting on the island in the lake. Now, following the opening of the park to the public, there were many positive comments made by the users of this new recreational space, which was described by the Lincolnshire Echo as the city's new Long, and that was back in 1931. Now, one correspondent to the Echo in May 1931, signing her or himself a satisfied ratepayer, you didn't get many letters to that, ending with that single expressed appreciation of the great improvements taking place in the park. Reference was made in the letter to the beautiful lake, the splendid asphalt walks, the rose gardens, the trees in full leaf. The council benefited from generous donations from local residents who clearly wished the new park to be enjoyed by Lincoln's residents. Perhaps most significantly, in 1931, the sum of £1,000 was donated by the widow and daughter of a recently deceased local politician, Alderman Wallace. Gifts of park benches were also forthcoming. 11 in total were donated in 1931. Gifts of trees were also made. Mr. Holton of Lee Road gave 7 willow trees in 1932. And organisations in the city also wished to express their support for the park. In the same year, the Lincoln Girl Guides arranged for a flowering tree to be planted in the park in celebration of the movement's 21st anniversary. Some inhabitants of the city, though, were not so supportive of all aspects of the park's development. In a time of significant economic recession, some correspondents in the local press described the park as a waste of the council's money. Others objected to the fact that the park's first superintendent, Luke Oates, was not a long-time resident of the city, at a time when there were over 4,500 registered unemployed in Lincoln in 1931. The labouring work associated with the deepening of the lake was undertaken by recruits from the city's unemployed workers, with funds paid by the government-funded Unemployed Grants Committee. Some outcry associated with the new park arose following the release of bylaws associated with the new facility in June 1932. As the Echo reported in August 1932, several park users, both adults and children, were brought before the magistrates at the Lincoln Police Court. Bylaws were introduced relating to no parking, keeping off some lawns, the forbidding of riding or even pushing bikes through the park. On this occasion, warnings were issued rather than convictions made, but there was vigorous criticism made of the severity of these bylaws. One member of the council described the procedures adopted as a most indecent expression of officialdom. Nevertheless, the bylaws were implemented, and there are regular reports in the local press of park users being convicted, particularly for riding or even just pushing their bikes through the park. Boultham Hall itself remained standing during the early years of the public park's existence until it was demolished in 1959. Given the description of the hall contained in the 1932 report, it's perhaps surprising to learn that it was not taken down sooner. In 1932, several of the hall's ground floor ceilings had collapsed. Its outside walls were overgrown with creepers, grass was growing on the roof, and a number of the hall's windows were broken. As a result of its bad state of repair, it was deemed at the time to be too costly to renovate. 2 other suggestions were discussed in the press. The first involved the demolition of the first and second floors, with the ground floor being turned into a refreshment room. A flat steel roof was to be installed on top, of which there was to be a bandstand and speakers. The second suggestion was complete demolition. Ultimately, it was the second proposal that was carried out, but 27 years later. Until its demolition, Boultham Hall played host to a ground floor cafe, which opened during the summer months, advertising ices and high-class confectionery, such as Pierce's ice cream, all the way from Nottingham, to the park's visitors. So, although the hall itself is no longer evident, there are some structures still in place which provide some evidence of Boultham Park's previous existence as a part of a private estate. Some of the former stable block and coach house remain, though the original E shape has been lost. There's also a gate dated 1846, a stone fountain, a pair of gate lodges and gate piers built in 1872. Within the grounds there were 2 cottages, called church cottages, dating back to 1642 and owned by the church commissioners. These gained a certain notoriety when in 1954 it was disclosed that these properties still had no mains water, and the occupants, one a widow, the other a husband, wife and 5 school-aged sons, had been reliant on what was described as a rusty iron pump in the garden until it was condemned by the council. Now the gates at the park's western entrance, which are dated 1895 and include the initials JR, were originally situated on Greenwell Road and gave access to Monk's Manor, home to the industrialist Joseph Ruston. So the gates were designed and constructed by Ruston's own employees. Soon after the departure of Joseph Ruston's eldest son, Colonel Seward Ruston, with his family from Monk's Manor in the 1920s, the large house which had been home to Joseph Ruston until his death in 1895 was demolished, and the gates were presented to Lincoln Corporation. It seemed apposite that access to a public park, which was to be enjoyed by many who'd been employed at Ruston's, should be gained by walking through Joseph Ruston's gates. And in 1934, the gates were duly installed at the new public park's entrance. Now, a number of further additions to the park were made in the 1930s. A new pavilion was built in 1934 to accommodate players of both bowls and tennis. In September 1934, members of the Lincoln Parks and Markets Committee met in Boultham Park, where they gathered to accept the gift of 4 swings and a seesaw from the People's Service Club. As the newspaper reported, members of the committee could not resist trying out the new playground equipment, including the seesaw. I don't think there are any photos of that, unfortunately. Other structural additions during the 1930s included a confectionery kiosk, heated greenhouses. These were built in 1936. In the same year, a bandstand was constructed. Though bands had been playing in the park before its unveiling, a temporary bandstand was constructed in 1933, though it's pretty basic, I think. One description describes it as a platform, which I think stretches the definition of a bandstand almost to breaking point. So the bandstand, when it was built, to accommodate 40 performers, it was octagonal in shape, 26 feet in diameter, with sliding glass wind screens built to shelter half of the bandstand. Now, rather unusually as well, for an inland bandstand, an outside dance floor was installed. It had an asphalt surface, was 800 square yards in area, and at its opening in August 1936, it was reported that councillors had hoped that someone would be willing to pay for the bandstand in the park, but as usual, they noted, they'd had to ask the ratepayers to foot the bill. It was anticipated that dancers would be charged a small amount for admission to the dance floor so as to be able to engage dance bands. And opening the bandstand, the mayor, Councillor Leaney, said he was quite the wrong person to do so, as he possessed no knowledge of music and had never danced in his life. Now, in 1937, a full programme of dances was advertised during June and July, with 5 dance nights, with Harold Rampton and his dance band performing between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock. The park grounds were to be illuminated for the occasion from dusk onwards. And this feature proved a very popular one, with dances being staged regularly through the summer months in the late 1930s, and indeed throughout the Second World War. And there was, I think, quite a vigorous band culture in Lincoln. Rob mentioned 2 brass bands accompanying Ellison's onto their grounds in the mid-1850s, and certainly by the 1930s there were a number of regular performances in the bandstands owned by the corporation, both at Boultham Park and at the Arboretum. So the Lincoln Malleable Ironworks Band, which later became known as the Borough Silver Band, was a regular fixture during the summer months in the bandstand here at Boultham Park. During the Second World War, the park was used to contribute to the war effort. The hall itself was offered to the army, but it was deemed too unsafe for use. As part of the Dig for Victory campaign, some of the flower beds were used for cultivation of cabbages and sugar beet. Pigs were reared on some of the parkland, and the council reduced the number of ducks on the park's lakes in an effort to economise on foodstuffs, though it was decided to add the rather colourful peacock to the park's bird life. So the park also played a part in seeking to maintain morale. Sunday band concerts, regular dances took place during the war's summer months. In addition to the brass bands, was during the war the Lincoln Home Guard military band, which performed regularly from 1942 onwards. The park's bowling greens continued to be in regular use during the war, and at the end of the hostilities, the park played host to a major Grand Victory concert staged by the Lincoln British Legion band. Following the war, one significant development which prompted much local press interest was the opening of the model railway in Boultham Park's grounds. Reports of the development of this new initiative first emerged in July 1946. The railway did not appear to be operational until 3 years later, in 1949. Soon after the reorganisation of Britain's railways and the founding of British Railways, the Echo noted in June 1949 that an unnationalised rail service will carry child passengers around part of Boultham Park. It reported that the operating company is the Lincoln Model Engineering Society. A total of 450 feet of track was laid in an oval form and ran through the park. 4 miniature locos made by members of the Model Engineering Society hauled wooden trolleys accommodating the volunteer child passengers. The paper explained that the model railway had taken 3 years to construct, partly because of problems with vandalism, and more significantly because of major difficulties caused by the floods of 1947, which had destroyed a lot of the cement used in the installation of the track. Now, when Boultham Park was demolished, it was just one of nearly 2,000 English country houses destroyed in the 20th century, of which 64 were in Lincolnshire. All that remains to indicate the location of Boultham Hall within the park is the original pediment, which provides the footprint of the original hall. The final part of the talk, I want to examine just briefly the residential building which took place in the land adjoining Boultham Park. Because I think when we talk about Boultham Park, it's important to sort of place it within its residential context. Back to the point that Steve started with, sort of places and spaces. Much of this residential development took place on land that had previously been part of the grounds of Boultham Hall itself. And some acknowledgement was made of this in advertising some of the private houses that sprung up on the roads adjoining the park's boundaries. Newly built, semi-detached houses were being advertised for sale on Boultham Park Road in 1937 and advertised as forming part of the Ellison estate. One of the estate show homes was advertised as an all-electric home, 36 Western Avenue. Admission was free, and it was noted that the house was completely furnished by Moore and Collingham, with all electrical equipment supplied by Lincoln Corporation Electricity Department. A year later, adverts appeared in the Echo, advertising new properties for sale on the Hunt Lee estate. Beautiful modern villas and bungalows were advertised, built to your own specifications and requirements. Prices were listed, cover your ears here, from £475 with a deposit of £25 and a weekly repayment of 12 shillings. Buildings on the outskirts of the park was not confined, though, to houses in the later 1930s. We have two in 1939, perhaps a rather lamented institution, the Parklands Hotel, which opened for the first time. Billed as the latest modern hotel in the old world style, the property was described on opening as being in the Tudor style, with a pleasing frontage of silver grey bricks, designed by a local Lincoln firm of Watkins and Coombs of Silver Street, and constructed by William Wright for the Newark-based brewery firm of Warwicks and Richardson. And it was reported that local residents had, until the pub's opening, had to walk a mile or further for refreshment, which perhaps indicates how undeveloped this part of the city had been until the 1930s. And alongside the private house building, a large-scale public housing development process began before the Second World War and was completed following the end of hostilities. Andrew Jackson has written quite extensively on this in the Survey of Lincoln's booklet, Boultham and Swallowbeck, and I sort of encourage you to read that. And it's worth noting that Lincoln's council was among the most proactive in beginning municipal house building in response to concerns surrounding the poor supply and condition of much domestic housing. One of the developments undertaken by the corporation was the Boultham housing estate. And the first houses in the housing estate were designed perhaps to be rather more restrained in their detailing than those, for instance, on the early St Giles estate along Rugby Road. But nonetheless, reference to the garden suburb movement is still apparent in some of the architectural lines. For instance, in the use of setbacks, arched alleyway entrances, as well as in the placing of small upper windows under relatively deep eaves and high-pitched roofs. Later on, the developments became a little bit more modernist in their architectural influence around this area. But finally, another quite distinctive type of residential development taking place in around Boultham Park, of course, was the several prefab housing developments that were undertaken. And perhaps the best known, owing to its location on a busy road in the city, is the development of the Outer Circle Drive. But more prefab homes were built in other parts of the city, including in the Boultham Park area. And these include just under 30 prefab homes, or aluminium bungalows as they were often described, on Grainsby Close off Rookery Lane, and a rather larger collection of 50 prefabs constructed in St Andrew's Gardens near to Boultham Park Road. And there's perhaps a misconception that these prefabs were cheaper to build. They weren't. They were actually more expensive to build than traditional brick-built houses. But of course, at a time when material was in tremendously short supply, prefabs consumed significantly fewer resources. So a prefab home weighed under 2 tons compared to 125 tons for a standard brick house. And after some teething troubles, the arrival of prefabs in Lincoln, as elsewhere in the country, led to much demand from prospective residents. And by 1951, in order to manage demand for these council properties, priority was given to the families of employees who worked in the export-led industries, which were described as dollar-making, helping to pay back the large loan received by Britain from the USA after the Second World War of $5 billion under the terms of the 1948 Marshall Plan. So in 1951, Lincoln's Housing Committee made the decision that only key employers in the city involved in the dollar-earning industries, it was only their employees who could occupy these prefabs. So people working for Ruston Hornsby, Ruston Bucyrus, Smith Clayton Forge, for instance. Priority was given to these individuals. So quite a range of differing types of housing stock surrounding the park. And undoubtedly, one of the key reasons why residential development in Boultham was so successful from the 1930s into the 1950s and beyond was the proximity to Boultham Park itself, which provided access to impressive landscaped grounds and, particularly in the summer months, to a range of leisure activities catering for the needs of all the family. So although Boultham Park is, relatively speaking, one of Lincoln's more recent parks, it and the surrounding area has a pretty fascinating history. And Boultham Park's past is still, relatively speaking, somewhat little explored. And I think there's still quite a lot more work to be done. Something that struck me was the limited range of photographic evidence. You have seen quite a few of the images I've shown here today elsewhere. And I think there's some work to be done seeking to obtain more historic photographic images of Boultham Park. And I think it's really exciting that we've got the opportunity within the city now to be exploring the Green Museum and perhaps bringing together the histories of these quite disparate green spaces. So hopefully you've been given a bit of an idea of some of the themes we can be exploring further elsewhere. Thank you very much.